Good morning. I'm reporting today on a rapidly escalating and potentially dangerous situation in the Middle East, where tensions between the United States and Iran have reached what many analysts are describing as a critical breaking point, with President Donald Trump issuing a stark and unmistakable warning to Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei that he should be very worried about the substantial American military armada that has been positioned throughout the Persian Gulf region, a massive show of force that includes multiple aircraft carrier strike groups, advanced fighter squadrons, guided missile destroyers and cruisers, nuclear-powered submarines, strategic bombers, sophisticated missile defense systems, and thousands of American military personnel now deployed across the Middle East in what Pentagon officials characterize as a defensive posture necessary to protect American interests and deter Iranian aggression, but which Tehran views as naked intimidation and provocation designed to undermine Iranian sovereignty and regional influence. The president's warning, delivered through both public statements and what sources describe as direct communication channels established through intermediaries, represents the latest escalation in a decades-long confrontation that dates back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Iranian revolutionaries overthrew the Shah and seized the American embassy in Tehran, holding 52 Americans hostage for 444 days in a crisis that traumatized the American psyche and set the tone for more than 4 decades of mutual hostility, mistrust, and periodic confrontation that has included the Iran-Iraq War, during which the United States supported Saddam Hussein, the 1988 shootdown of Iran Air Flight 655 by the USS Vincennes, killing 290 civilians, years of increasingly severe economic sanctions, the controversial 2015 nuclear agreement from which Trump withdrew, and now this current crisis which emerges from multiple interconnected issues, including Iran's nuclear program that Western intelligence agencies believe is aimed at developing weapons capability, Iran's support for militant groups across the region from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthis in Yemen, Iran's development of sophisticated ballistic missiles, and fundamental disagreements about the regional order and whether Iran should be accepted as a major power with legitimate security interests or contained and pressured until its government changes behavior or collapses entirely. The military forces that the United States has assembled represent one of the most formidable concentrations of American power in the region since the Iraq War, with the USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike groups providing a combined force of more than 120 advanced fighter aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets and F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, multiple Aegis-equipped cruisers and destroyers capable of intercepting ballistic missiles and launching precision strikes, attack submarines that can operate undetected while carrying massive firepower, B-52 bombers deployed to regional bases with capability to strike deep into Iranian territory, and additional Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems positioned to protect American forces and allies from potential Iranian missile attacks, creating a military presence that sends an unambiguous message about American commitment to defending its interests, but which also carries significant risks of miscalculation or accidental escalation that could trigger the very conflict both sides claim to want to avoid. Iranian officials have responded with characteristic defiance, with Supreme Leader Khamenei declaring that Iran will not be intimidated by American threats, that the Islamic Republic has faced down greater challenges throughout its history, and that any attack would be met with what Revolutionary Guard commanders describe as a crushing response targeting not only U.S. military assets, but also the critical infrastructure of American allies, including oil facilities and desalination plants, with particular concern focused on the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass daily, making it arguably the world's most strategically important maritime choke point and giving Iran significant leverage despite its conventional military inferiority, as any sustained disruption to Persian Gulf oil flows would send energy prices soaring and could trigger global economic recession. The current sanctions regime represents some of the most comprehensive economic pressure ever applied outside of wartime, targeting Iran's oil exports that previously generated the bulk of government revenue, cutting Iranian banks off from the international financial system, restricting access to foreign currency, and creating severe economic hardship with inflation running into triple digits, unemployment surging particularly among young people, shortages of basic goods and medicines affecting millions of Iranians, the currency losing more than 80% of its value, middle-class families seeing their savings and purchasing power evaporate, and a general sense of hopelessness spreading rippling through society, leading human rights advocates to question whether sanctions that primarily hurt innocent civilians can be justified even in pursuit of legitimate security objectives, while sanctions proponents argue that economic pressure remains preferable to military action and that the Iranian regime bears responsibility through its choices to pursue nuclear weapons, support terrorism, and prioritize regional ambitions over the welfare of its population. Military analysts attempting to game out potential conflict scenarios emphasize that any confrontation would likely begin with American air and missile strikes aimed at degrading Iran's military capabilities, destroying nuclear facilities, eliminating command and control systems, and taking out air defense networks, possibly followed by naval blockade to prevent oil exports and cut off imports. But they also warned that Iran would respond asymmetrically rather than attempting conventional military operations it knows it would lose, instead unleashing its missile arsenal against U.S. bases and allied nations, activating proxy forces throughout the region to attack American interests, attempting to close the Strait of Hormuz through mining or anti-ship missiles, launching cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in the United States and allied countries, and possibly attempting terrorist operations globally, creating a multi-front conflict that could last months or years with casualties and costs far exceeding initial projections. The role of regional allies adds complexity, with Israel viewing Iranian nuclear weapons as an existential threat and having made clear it would consider military action to prevent nuclear breakout regardless of American support. Saudi Arabia and the UAE deeply concerned about Iranian regional influence but also worried about becoming targets of retaliation. European allies urging restraint and warning that conflict would be catastrophic for global security and economic stability, and other nations from Turkey to Pakistan watching nervously as two major powers move toward potential confrontation in a region vital to global energy supplies and strategic stability. The nuclear issue remains at the heart of Western concerns, with intelligence assessments suggesting Iran has accumulated sufficient enriched uranium and technical expertise that it could produce weapons-grade material in weeks if it made that political decision, though building a deliverable weapon would take longer, and this breakout time has become critical in debates about when diplomacy must give way to military action, with Israeli officials arguing Iran must never reach the point where it could quickly produce nuclear weapons because that would fundamentally alter the regional balance and potentially trigger proliferation as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt pursue their own programs, creating a multipolar nuclear Middle East where risks of nuclear war would increase dramatically. Diplomatic efforts continue despite bellicose rhetoric, with intermediaries including Oman, Qatar, and Switzerland attempting to facilitate dialogue and identify compromises, with possible elements including Iranian commitments to enhanced inspections and limits on enrichment, restrictions on missile development, reduction in proxy support, and release of detained nationals in exchange for sanctions relief, security guarantees against regime change, and potentially normalized relations, though the gap between positions and deep mutual mistrust make comprehensive agreement extremely difficult, particularly given domestic political constraints where leaders face pressure from hardliners who view compromise as weakness. Former senior officials who dealt with Iran warn that while military force might achieve tactical objectives like destroying nuclear facilities, it wouldn't address underlying drivers of Iranian behavior and could make things worse by eliminating remaining moderates, rallying public opinion behind a resented regime, complicating efforts to counter Iranian influence where populations might view conflict as American aggression, straining alliances with partners who oppose military action, and failing to achieve stable outcomes without political strategy to accompany military operations. Though other voices argue diplomacy has been tried repeatedly with limited success and only credible military threat will convince Tehran to moderate behavior. The economic implications extend globally, with oil markets responding nervously to escalating tensions, financial markets experiencing volatility as investors assess conflict probability, and economists warning that major confrontation could trigger worldwide recession by driving up energy costs, disrupting trade routes, creating financial instability, and forcing governments to divert resources from productive investment to military spending, with particularly severe effects on developing countries dependent on oil imports with limited financial reserves. The historical pattern of Middle East conflicts suggests wars tend to last longer, cost cost more and produce more unintended consequences than planners anticipate, with the 2003 Iraq invasion demonstrating how difficult it is to create stable governance after destroying existing structures, and Iran presents even greater challenges given its larger population, diverse ethnic composition, sophisticated society, proud nationalist traditions transcending the current government that would likely produce fierce resistance to anything perceived as foreign occupation, and strategic location, creating opportunities for external interference that could prolong chaos, suggesting that while military force could destroy much of Iran's infrastructure, creating anything resembling stable pro-Western government would be extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The potential for miscalculation remains frightening, with history providing examples of conflicts spiraling out of control when forces are on high alert. Communication limited, intelligence incomplete, domestic pressures constrain flexibility, and fog of war makes understanding actual events difficult, though the Cold War demonstrated that even dangerous confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis can be managed if leaders maintain communication, resist escalation pressures, and prioritize avoiding catastrophe over scoring political points. The role of proxy networks Iran has cultivated represents a key element of its power projection strategy, with Hezbollah in Lebanon being the most sophisticated, having grown into what amounts to a state within a state with perhaps 100,000 rockets pointed at Israel, creating situations where Israeli-Iranian conflict would almost certainly involve massive rocket barrages against Israeli cities, triggering retaliation against both Hezbollah and Iranian targets, while the Houthis in Yemen have demonstrated Iran's ability to threaten Saudi interests and commercial shipping despite arm's-length relationship, and various Iraqi militias provide capability to attack American forces while maintaining plausible deniability. The question of congressional authorization has become contentious, with some lawmakers insisting the Constitution grants Congress alone power to declare war, and that the president must seek authorization before launching operations except in emergency response to direct attack, while administration officials cite previous authorizations and inherent constitutional authority as commander-in-chief as providing sufficient basis, creating constitutional standoff reflecting broader concerns about executive power in national security decisions. The international legal dimensions remain contentious, with the UN Charter generally prohibiting force except in self-defense or when authorized by the Security Council, meaning preemptive American attack would likely be viewed as illegal unless demonstrating imminent threat, though legal considerations have rarely prevented powerful nations from acting when leaders believe vital interests are at stake. As we continue monitoring this dangerous situation, President Trump's warning represents a moment of extraordinary peril that could lead either to diplomatic breakthrough if both sides recognize catastrophic consequences and find ways to address security concerns through negotiation, or to military conflict causing immense suffering, economic devastation, and regional instability with global reverberations, making this truly one of the most critical moments in recent international history, underscoring the awesome responsibility on leaders who must choose between difficult diplomacy and terrible certainties of war. And as we bring you continuing coverage, we remain committed to providing context and analysis. You need to understand what's at stake and why decisions made in Washington and Tehran matter for everyone who depends on Middle East stability for energy security, economic prosperity, and global peace. The Revolutionary Guard Corps itself represents a unique military and political force that has no equivalent in other countries, having emerged from the 1979 revolution as an ideologically committed organization loyal to the supreme leader, growing over decades into a massive entity controlling not just military forces but vast economic enterprises through front companies in construction, telecommunications, oil and gas, and numerous other sectors, making it a state within the state with vested interests in maintaining confrontation because external threats justify its expanded role in society and control over resources, while also creating situations where diplomatic agreements must address not just government policy but also interests of this powerful organization that might resist compromises threatening its position. The humanitarian consequences of potential conflict would be severe, with aid organizations warning that fighting could displace millions of civilians, destroy critical infrastructure including hospitals and schools and water treatment facilities, disrupt food supplies in a country depending heavily on imports, create refugee flows straining neighbors already dealing with displaced populations from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and potentially trigger public health catastrophe if healthcare collapses or chemical or biological weapons are used, while longer-term effects could include economic devastation, environmental damage from burning oil facilities, and psychological trauma affecting an entire generation. The cyber warfare dimension deserves particular attention as it represents relatively new domain where rules are still being established and capabilities closely guarded, with Iran having demonstrated sophisticated capabilities through previous attacks on American financial institutions and Saudi oil company Saudi Aramco, while the United States possesses even more advanced offensive capabilities as demonstrated by Stuxnet attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. Creating situations where both sides could inflict serious damage through cyber means either as prelude to kinetic operations or standalone retaliatory actions, though risks include that attacks could escalate unpredictably or cause unintended damage if malware spreads beyond targets. The intelligence community's track record on Middle East issues is mixed, with accurate assessments in some cases, but significant failures, including mistaken belief Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, failure to anticipate Arab Spring uprisings, and ongoing challenges penetrating closed societies like Iran and understanding decision-making in authoritarian systems where power is concentrated and information tightly controlled, meaning current assessments about Iranian capabilities and intentions should be approached with appropriate humility, recognizing that surprises are possible. The environmental consequences could be catastrophic, with the 1991 Gulf War providing preview when Iraqi forces set fire to more than 600 Kuwaiti oil wells, creating massive toxic smoke affecting regional air quality, while oil spills damaged marine ecosystems for years, suggesting much larger conflict involving Iran's extensive oil and petrochemical facilities could create environmental damage persisting for decades, affecting populations across Middle East and beyond, while also raising concerns about potential chemical or biological weapons use that would represent major escalation, likely provoking international intervention. The precedent set by how this crisis resolves will have implications far beyond U.S.-Iran relations, influencing how countries think about nuclear proliferation, effectiveness of economic sanctions, role of international institutions in constraining major powers, how alliances function when members have divergent interests, and fundamentally whether 21st century international system will be governed by rules and norms or by raw power and willingness to use military force, questions that will shape global politics for decades. The role of media coverage deserves attention, as both American and Iranian populations receive filtered, often propagandistic information, with American media emphasizing Iranian threats and human rights abuses while giving less attention to legitimate security concerns or humanitarian impact of sanctions, while Iranian state media presents narratives of American imperialism and Western plots while downplaying regime repression and regional activities genuinely concerning neighbors, creating parallel information universes where publics develop very different understandings of who bears responsibility and what would constitute reasonable solutions. The question of what would come after potential regime change represents great uncertainty that should temper enthusiasm for military options, with Iraq demonstrating how difficult creating stable governance after destroying existing structures even when oppressive, and Iran presents greater challenges given larger population, diverse ethnic composition, sophisticated society with high education and urbanization creating expectations for political participation, and proud nationalist traditions transcending current government that would produce fierce resistance to perceived foreign occupation, suggesting that while military force could destroy much infrastructure, creating stable pro-Western government would be extraordinarily difficult. The technological asymmetry between American and Iranian capabilities is stark, with the United States possessing stealth aircraft, precision munitions, advanced surveillance systems, satellite networks, and cutting-edge technologies Iran cannot match, but technologic